children shares in the company, which were effectively their inheritance from the late Mayor Ford. Just fascinating stuff that it came out, and like she had been talking about doing something along these lines for several months. Apparently, like there's a lot of turmoil in that family from the smell of things. The Ford matriarch, Doug and Rob's mother, came out and saying that Renata had serious drug problems, which, you know, kind of like, I kind of want to be like, well, that's just muckraking for the sake of it, but, you know, maybe, you know, it's not outside the realm of possibilities here in that family. It's really interesting to me how the Ford family is so intent on being, you know, we have our private lives, but then they have these really super public blow-ups at the same time, like in the same breath. Really interesting, and nonetheless, if I had to make a prediction right now, which again, you can literally look up, if you don't know them already, the election results right now. If I had to make a prediction, I'm going to say it's like a slight progressive conservative minority government. The Liberals, I'm going to say, hold on to their official party status, but only just. Kathleen Wynne has probably resigned as party leader by now. If she hadn't already before the election, I'm really not sure. I suppose she couldn't before the election because she is on the ballot. I guess that would be the way that it would go. I actually don't know. If you're like a poli-sci nut out there who would know the answer to that question for me, if you follow politics, if you're in the Ontario Liberals at a high level and you want to give me a quote, why would you do that? Anywho, I think that's it for this little section here. We'll move on after this. We're going to talk about a trial down in Chicago between Dr. Chris Amon, or Amon, or nobody really knows how to pronounce his name, and Scott Colton and Phil Brooks, a.k.a. Colt Cabana and CM Punk. Right after this. So there's a fair amount of backstory to this next, story. And if you happen to already know it, I apologize. I'm definitely going to be, treading over a bunch of stuff in real quick succession, and I'm probably going to be missing some details that you may find to be key details. But I don't really care if I'm being 100% honest about it. So this past week, last week into this week, was a trial between the plaintiff, Dr. Chris Amon, or Amon, again, I'm really not sure how to pronounce it, who's a chief physician for the WWE, against both former WWE superstars, Colt Cabana and CM Punk. Of course, they have real names that I gave you earlier on in the show, but whatever. So this all stems back to a podcast. Of course, Colt Cabana hosts a podcast, which I kind of stole bits and pieces from for this show. We have very similar outros, and I like Colt Cabana's just general speaking his being, I guess, quite a bit. So I try and emulate, try and steal from the best as far as I'm concerned. So Colt Cabana had CM Punk on his podcast, The Art of Wrestling, a couple years back. And of course, by a couple, I mean almost 4. God, time is moving so quickly. So back in November of 2014, Colt Cabana had CM Punk on his podcast. Earlier that year, Punk had kind of unceremoniously just sort of walked away from the WWE. And there was a lot of rumor and speculation as to why he had left, what the reasons were. And this sort of sit-down 90-minute podcast between two good friends was Cabana's opportunity to allow Punk the opportunity to tell his side of the story, to tell why he had quit the WWE. Through the course of that podcast, Punk made some allegations about his health and about how WWE doctors had dealt with it. In particular, in question were a number of injuries, which kind of come part and parcel to doing that job, but also a lump on his lower. They said on the podcast his lower back, but it was actually sort of on his left buttock. Basically, a lump that was possibly staph, was possibly MRSA, was definitely a cyst, and was not getting adequate treatment in Punk's mind. So through the course of this podcast, Punk told the story as he understood it to be true, and Cabana interviewed him essentially, and asked him questions, and certainly had lived to this. They were close friends at the time. Apparently, some rumors that there was a bit of falling out between the two of them, but they seemed to be cordial enough from court reports. So hopefully, I hope that they're doing okay. I like those two as a pair. But anyhow, long story short, Cabana and Punk did this interview. Then they did a sort of a follow-up question and answer podcast the following week, and that was that. Chris Amon, I'm just going to go with Amon. He was sort of named, I think, one time in the entire show. Punk talked about the medical team at WWE not following through with him in terms of some concussion issues, and of course with that lump. And as a result, Amon decided that he was going to sue both Punk and Cabana for defamation, libel, all that fun jazz in the Circle Court of Cook County, Illinois. I actually just as I was sitting down to record this, found Amon's original complaint. And I want to take a chance to sort of read through it. It's 15 pages long, so I'm not going to do that before this show. But this week, the trial wrapped up, and a jury came back and said not guilty to all charges for both Punk and Cabana, which I think is really ultimately really good news. Amon he was asking for some money. I think it was a case where the lawyers were just asking for what the maximum dollar value could possibly reasonably, feasibly ever be if the judge was really, really against Punk and Cabana for whatever reason. Like if for some reason it was a judge who hated professional wrestling, hated professional wrestlers, hated guys with tattoos, hated Jewish guys, hated small businessmen, and was also on the WWE payroll. What was the maximum dollar figure that they could possibly get? Essentially, what it was going to boil down to was $1 for every listen of the podcast, which from each of them, from each Cabana and Punk, which would have been about $4 million each, plus general damages, which would have been like tens of millions of dollars, sort of on top of that. This was pretty interesting way in which it was covered. I'm kind of used to here, like if I know that something interesting is happening at the provincial court or at the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia here in Halifax, I've got a pretty good sense that one of the local journalists here from the CBC or from Global will be live tweeting it, and these will be journalists who have kind of backing in how the court system works, kind of have a sense of how the courts work, how the law works. Certainly they're not lawyers. Certainly they're not going to give expert legal analysis, but they're certainly going to they're going to know what to put out there, what to talk about, what to write about in a long form article, what to tweet about in the short term, in terms of what's actually interesting, what's actually relevant, and what's actually important. In this case, it was covered by, and I think like for what it was, quite admirably done. It was covered by sort of a wrestling journalist. So Ross Berman of WrestleZone.com, possibly Mandatory.com now, I'm not really sure, was there. He's kind of a wrestling journalist type of guy. He writes for WrestleZone from time to time, and he was sort of live tweeting the trial. It was an interesting look because it was like so. And I don't want to say any of this to put the guy down. I think he did a pretty good job, all things considered. There was certainly a fair amount of stuff that he didn't include, that he tweeted about sort of later, like, talking about how many objections were thrown at any given time. He would highlight certain objections, but like there were certain things that he talked about just sort of generally that I'm just like, well, I would have liked to have read that at the time. But it was interesting to sort of see a breakdown. So I'm just taking a look right now at notes from day 4, which was June the 1st. We're looking at last Friday, and basically, like, there was some talk about like pre-trial discussion between counsel about suits, which is kind of interesting little flavor, I guess. But like stuff like defense tries to get Cabana to talk about his childhood and early days of wrestling, but a series of objections derail this line of questioning. Now, this is interesting, but there's like no analysis about why or what that might be about, right? What I think that ultimately is, and I think Cabana actually does talk about this on his Art of Wrestling this week. I got a chance to listen to it quickly before I was recording. He does talk about, like, this was an effort on behalf of Cabana's lawyer, who I guess is this like 70-year-old hardened Chicago attorney who's literally retired after his last client, Colt Cabana, won his trial. Basically this was a strategy of trying to get the jury on side with Cabana in terms of him just being a fan of wrestling and a fan of storytelling, and really interesting. Here's my sort of vibe of how the trial went. Of course, I wasn't there. I haven't read any sort of official transcripts or anything along those lines. The vibe that I was getting from everything that I've read and from listening to Cabana's podcast is that Eamon's lawyers did a really, really great job of some of the courtroom management stuff. And what I mean by that is they did a really great job of objecting at appropriate times, of trying to derail lines of questioning to try to throw the jury off of certain lines of questioning to make things less intriguing, less interesting, and less advantageous, I guess, for Punk and Cabana when they were being directly examined by their own attorneys. And that's a very valid skill and very important skill in the courtroom. Right, you want to use those objections in such a way that you're not overusing them and annoying anybody and making your own self come off as a bit of a shitheel. But you also want to be able to use them in such a way that, like I said, sort of derails and doesn't allow the opposing counsel to tell their story in the most sympathetic or best light. It's an important skill. It's an important half of trials, and it's certainly something that not everybody's particularly good at. The other thing that not all lawyers are particularly good at, and in my experience in terms of the trials that I've watched in person, not a lot of lawyers are great at, is the actual act of being an engaging an engaging questioner. You get courtroom shows and your Law and Orders or Laws and Order. I don't know. Is it like Attorneys General? I'm really not sure. Anyhow, your SVUs out in the world, where you get this picture of attorneys being these incredibly polished speakers who are very, very eloquent and very very moving in the court.